1. The mind you don't notice. Imagine waking up tomorrow morning and going through your day exactly as you normally would. Your alarm rings, you reach for your phone, you glance at the screen before you're even fully awake. Perhaps you check the time, read a message, or scroll through a few notifications. Then you get out of bed, walk toward the bathroom, choose what to wear, and begin thinking about everything you need to do. It all feels effortless, natural, almost automatic. And that's the strange part. Because beneath every one of those ordinary moments, your brain is quietly making thousands of decisions that you never consciously experience. You don't usually notice yourself deciding which sounds are important and which ones can be ignored. You don't feel yourself filtering out the countless objects in the room that have no immediate relevance. You don't consciously calculate how much attention to give a person's voice, how to interpret the expression on their face, or how to predict what might happen next. Your mind simply does it. And then it gives you the finished experience. It's almost as if you are sitting inside a theater, watching a beautifully produced film, while an enormous production crew works silently behind the curtain. You see the scene. You hear the dialogue. You feel the emotion. But you rarely see the machinery creating it. Take a moment to think about that. Right now, wherever you are, there are probably dozens of sounds around you. Perhaps a fan is humming, traffic is moving somewhere in the distance, a door has closed, or someone nearby is speaking. You could consciously focus on any of them, but most of them disappear from your awareness. Not because they aren't there, because your brain has decided they don't matter enough. And this is only one tiny example of how your mind shapes your experience of reality. Throughout an ordinary day, your brain filters information, predicts what is likely to happen, searches through memories, evaluates threats, interprets other people's behavior, and influences decisions before you are even aware that a decision is being made. None of this means that your mind is broken. Quite the opposite. These processes are part of what allows a human being to function without being overwhelmed by the sheer amount of information surrounding them. But there is something deeply strange about it. We tend to believe that we experience the world exactly as it is. We open our eyes and assume we simply see reality. We remember something and assume the memory is an accurate recording. We make a choice and assume we know why we made it. Yet psychology repeatedly shows that the mind is not simply recording reality. It is interpreting it, constructing it, filtering it, sometimes even quietly changing it. So as we move through the next 28 strange psychological effects, keep one thought in the back of your mind. You are not going to discover that your mind is unreliable. You are going to discover just how remarkably active it has been all along. And perhaps the strangest part is that while your brain has been quietly shaping your experience every second of every day, you have probably never noticed most of it. And that brings us to our first strange effect, the moment you learn about something new, and suddenly, almost mysteriously, it seems to be everywhere. 2. The frequency illusion. Have you ever learned a new word and then suddenly started seeing it everywhere? Perhaps you hear an unfamiliar name for the first time. Maybe it's the name of a city, a scientific concept, a particular car, or even a word you've somehow never noticed before. You think, how have I never heard this before? And then something strange happens. The next day you see it in an article. Then someone mentions it in conversation. A few hours later, it appears in a video you're watching. And eventually, you begin to wonder if the universe has somehow decided to place this particular thing directly in your path. But usually, something much quieter is happening. Your brain has simply started paying attention. This phenomenon is often called the frequency illusion, sometimes associated with the Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. It describes the feeling that something you've recently noticed has suddenly become much more common. But in many cases, the world hasn't changed. Your attention has. Before you learned the unfamiliar word, your brain had very little reason to highlight it. It was just another tiny piece of information passing through an enormous stream of sensory input. You might have encountered it dozens of times without consciously registering it. Then something changes. You learn what it means. It becomes relevant. And suddenly, your brain recognizes it. It's a little like buying a particular model of car and then noticing how many of them are on the road. The cars didn't suddenly multiply overnight. You simply developed a mental template for spotting them. Your attention has become tuned to a new frequency. And once something becomes relevant, the brain is remarkably good at finding it. There is another subtle effect involved here too. Once you expect to see something, every new appearance can feel like confirmation. You remember the times you noticed it, while all the countless moments when it didn't appear remain invisible. This creates a curious psychological loop. You notice something. Your brain decides it matters. You begin noticing it more often. The increased noticing makes it seem more common. And because it seems more common, you become even more certain that something unusual is happening. Take a moment to reflect on that. How many things in your life might actually be more noticeable rather than more common? A certain name, a particular type of person, a song, a fear, a problem, perhaps even a thought about yourself. The world around us contains far more information than conscious attention can handle, so the brain has to choose what enters the spotlight. And once something becomes important, that spotlight can follow it everywhere. Which means that sometimes, when it feels like the world has suddenly changed, the world may be exactly the same. You are simply seeing a different version of it. And if attention can suddenly make something visible, the next question becomes even stranger. What happens when your attention is focused so intensely on one thing that you completely fail to notice something else standing right in front of you? 3. The invisible gorilla. Imagine you're watching a video of several people passing a basketball between them. Your instructions are simple. Count the number of times the ball is passed. So you concentrate. You watch the hands. You follow the ball. You keep count carefully, perhaps whispering the numbers to yourself. 1, 2, 3. Your attention narrows until the movement of the ball seems to become the entire world. And then, after the video ends, someone asks you a strange question. Did you notice the person in the gorilla costume? For many people, the answer is no. A person can walk directly through the scene, remain visible for several seconds, and still go completely unnoticed. This is the phenomenon known as inattentional blindness. And it reveals something deeply unsettling about perception. We often assume that if our eyes are open, we're seeing everything in front of us. But seeing is not quite the same as consciously noticing. Your eyes may receive information from the environment, but your attention decides which parts of that information become important enough to reach conscious awareness. Think of attention as a flashlight in a dark room. Wherever you point it, details become vivid. You can examine them. You can think about them. But everything outside the beam becomes much harder to notice. And the room itself hasn't disappeared. Your attention simply isn't illuminating it. This is why inattentional blindness can occur in ordinary life. Someone might walk into a room while you're deeply focused on a conversation. You might fail to notice a familiar object sitting in an unusual location. A driver concentrating on one aspect of traffic may overlook another important detail. The strange thing is that, afterward, we can feel certain we would have noticed something so obvious. But obviousness is not enough. Attention has limited capacity. The brain is constantly deciding what deserves priority. And when one task becomes sufficiently demanding, other information can slip through the cracks. Take a moment to reflect on that. How much of your surroundings are you actually experiencing right now? Perhaps there are sounds you haven't consciously heard, objects you haven't really looked at, sensations you haven't noticed. Your brain is surrounded by information, but conscious awareness receives only a small portion of it. This changes the way we might think about perception. We don't simply walk through the world, recording everything like a camera. Instead, we construct a useful version of the world from the information our brains consider relevant. Most of the time, this works beautifully. But occasionally, something enormous can pass through our visual field, while our conscious mind remains completely unaware. And if attention can make something as obvious as a person in a gorilla costume effectively disappear, then perhaps attention can also do the opposite. Perhaps it can make something seem far more important than it really is, especially when we begin to believe that everyone else is watching us. And that brings us to the strangely uncomfortable world of the spotlight effect. For the spotlight effect, imagine walking into a room and suddenly realizing that something about your appearance feels wrong. Maybe your shirt is slightly wrinkled. Maybe your hair isn't sitting the way you wanted. Perhaps you notice a small stain that somehow escaped your attention earlier. And suddenly, everything changes. You become aware of yourself. You begin wondering whether anyone else noticed. Someone looks in your direction. Was that because of the stain? Someone whispers to a friend. Were they talking about you? You walk across the room, and for the next few minutes, it feels as though an invisible spotlight is following you. But here's the strange part. There probably isn't one. This is known as the spotlight effect, the tendency to overestimate how much other people notice our appearance, mistakes, awkward moments, and behavior. It's as though our minds imagine that everyone else is watching us with the same intensity that we watch ourselves. But there is a simple reason this happens. You are always experiencing your own thoughts directly. You know when you're nervous. You know when you made a mistake. You know exactly what you're wearing. You hear every awkward pause in your own voice. Other people don't have access to that private stream of information. They are busy experiencing their own. Imagine walking through a crowded street. You might notice someone wearing an unusual jacket for a moment. Then, seconds later, you've forgotten them completely. That person may have spent the next 10 minutes wondering whether everyone noticed their jacket. The experience feels enormous from the inside because the self occupies so much of our mental attention. Psychologists have found that people often overestimate how much their noticeable features or mistakes stand out to others. And this can happen even when we intellectually know that everyone is probably focused on themselves. The emotional feeling can still remain. Take a moment to reflect on that. Think of something embarrassing you did several years ago. You may still remember it vividly. Perhaps you can feel the awkwardness returning for a moment. But how many other people involved in that moment do you think remember it with the same intensity? Probably far fewer than you imagine. This doesn't mean that nobody notices us. People obviously do notice one another. The strange point is that our minds can exaggerate the size of the audience. A tiny moment becomes a psychological stage. A small mistake becomes a performance. A passing glance becomes evidence of judgment. And sometimes, this imagined spotlight can influence the way we behave. We may avoid speaking. We may change what we wear. We may hesitate to enter a room. We may replay conversations. 5. Familiarity feels like safety. Imagine hearing a song for the first time. At first, it doesn't seem particularly special. You don't dislike it. You don't love it. It is simply there, passing through the background of your day. Then you hear it again. And again. Perhaps it plays while you're traveling, while you're working, or quietly in the background of an ordinary evening. After a while, something changes. You begin recognizing the melody before the chorus arrives. You know what comes next. And one day, without really noticing when it happened, you realize that you like the song. Nothing about the recording has changed. You have. This strange tendency is known as the mere exposure effect. In simple terms, we can develop a greater preference for something simply because we've encountered it repeatedly. It can happen with music, images, words, places, faces, and even certain ideas. The interesting part is that we don't necessarily need to consciously study or analyze something for familiarity to influence us. Our brains are constantly building expectations. When something is familiar, it becomes easier to process. We know what to expect. There are fewer surprises. And that sense of predictability can sometimes feel comforting. Think about walking into your own home after being away for several days. The room probably looks exactly as it did before. The furniture hasn't suddenly become more beautiful. The walls haven't changed. Yet there can be a quiet feeling of relief simply because everything is recognizable. You know where things are. You know the sounds. You know the layout. Familiarity reduces uncertainty. And the human mind generally has a strong interest in reducing uncertainty. Take a moment to reflect on the things you encounter every day. The route you take. The voice of someone close to you. The chair you usually sit in. The opening sound of an app. The smell of a familiar place. The more often something enters our experience, the easier it can become to process and recognize. But there is a more mysterious side to this effect. If repeated exposure can increase our liking for something, then perhaps our preferences are not always as independent as they feel. Maybe some things we enjoy became comforting partly because they became familiar. Maybe certain songs became favorites because we heard them during important periods of our lives. Maybe a particular place feels special partly because our mind has associated it with safety, routine, or meaningful memories. Of course, familiarity doesn't make us like everything. Repeated exposure to something unpleasant can have very different effects. Context, intensity, and our initial reactions all matter. Still, the mere exposure effect reveals something subtle about preference. Sometimes the mind doesn't ask, is this completely new and exciting? It asks something quieter. Have I encountered this before? And when the answer is yes, the familiar can feel easier. Safer. More comfortable. Perhaps that is why unfamiliarity can sometimes feel unsettling, even when there is nothing objectively wrong with the new thing. The strange thing is that our minds are constantly balancing two desires. We want novelty, but we also want familiarity. We want to discover something new, while still having something recognizable to return to. And that tension leads naturally to our next psychological effect. Because if familiarity can influence what we like, what happens when we're given too many things to choose from? At first, more choices sound like freedom. But sometimes, the more possibilities we have, the harder it becomes to choose anything at all. 6. When more choices make you less free. Imagine walking into a restaurant because you're hungry. You expect a simple decision. You open the menu. There are 5 dishes. Easy enough. Then you turn the page. There are another 20. Then another page. Pasta, rice, sandwiches, curries, salads, soups, desserts, combinations, variations, sizes, toppings, substitutions. Suddenly, you are no longer thinking about what you want to eat. You're thinking about everything you might be missing. This is the strange psychological phenomenon known as choice overload, closely connected to what is sometimes called the paradox of choice. At first, having more options seems like an obvious benefit. If 5 choices are good, surely 50 choices must be better. More freedom. More variety. More opportunities to find exactly what you want. But the human mind doesn't always experience it that way. Every additional option creates another comparison. And every comparison creates another possibility that the choice you make might not be the best one. Imagine choosing between 2 phones. You compare the screens, cameras, batteries, and prices. Eventually, you decide. Now imagine choosing between 20 phones. You begin comparing tiny differences. One has a slightly better camera. Another has a longer battery. Another is cheaper. Another has better reviews. Another comes in a color you prefer. The decision becomes less about finding something good and more about eliminating the fear of choosing something worse. And that is where choice can become psychologically exhausting. Take a moment to notice how strange that is. Freedom is usually something we think should make us happier. Yet too much freedom can create uncertainty, hesitation, and even regret. You might finally make a decision and then immediately wonder about the options you rejected. Perhaps the other phone had a better camera. Perhaps the other restaurant would have been more enjoyable. Perhaps another career would have been better. The choice is over, but the comparison continues. This can create a subtle form of psychological discomfort, the feeling that somewhere among the possibilities was a perfect option you failed to discover. Of course, there may never have been a perfect option. There were simply different trade-offs. But the mind can have difficulty accepting that. We often want not merely a good choice, but reassurance that we made the right choice. And the larger the menu of possibilities, the harder that reassurance can become. This is one reason simple routines can sometimes feel peaceful. Ordering the same coffee. Taking the same route. Wearing a familiar outfit. Choosing a familiar meal. These decisions may seem boring, but they remove dozens of tiny choices from the day. The mind gets to rest. And perhaps that is one of the quiet lessons hidden inside the paradox of choice. More possibilities do not automatically create more satisfaction. Sometimes peace comes from knowing that you don't have to consider everything. But there is another problem. Even when we think we're evaluating our options freely, the very first piece of information we encounter can quietly influence everything that comes afterward. A number, a price, an estimate, a suggestion, something that seems insignificant at first. And once it enters the mind, it can become an invisible reference point, a mental anchor. And that is where our next strange psychological effect begins. 7. The anchor that pulls your mind. Imagine walking into a store and seeing a watch. Its price tag says rupee 20,000. You look at it for a moment. Then underneath, you see another number. Now rupee 8,000. Suddenly, rupee 8,000 doesn't feel quite as expensive. It feels like a bargain. But imagine walking into a different store and seeing a similar watch priced at 4,000. Now rupee 8,000 feels expensive. The watch itself hasn't changed. Your perception of its value has. This is an example of a psychological phenomenon known as anchoring. Anchoring occurs when an initial piece of information influences the judgments we make afterward. That first piece of information becomes a kind of mental reference point or anchor. And once an anchor enters our mind, it can quietly pull our estimates toward it. The strange part is that the anchor doesn't always need to be meaningful. Even an arbitrary number can sometimes influence later judgments. Imagine being asked whether the population of a city is greater or smaller than 1 million. Then you're asked to estimate the actual population. The first number may influence the estimate, even if you had no good reason to believe that 1 million was relevant. It's as though the mind says, "We started here, so perhaps the answer is somewhere nearby." You might encounter anchoring while shopping, negotiating, answering questions, or even evaluating yourself. A product is described as normally costing a certain amount. A salary is presented before a negotiation begins. Someone casually suggests how difficult a task will be. A friend gives you their opinion before you've formed your own. That first information can become the starting point from which everything else is judged. Take a moment to reflect on how often your thoughts begin with something that came from outside you. A price, a headline, a number, someone else's expectation, a first impression. Once that information is present, it can be surprisingly difficult to imagine what you would have thought without it. And this is where anchoring becomes especially interesting. We often imagine that our judgments emerge from careful reasoning. We compare the evidence. We consider the possibilities. Then we reach a conclusion. But sometimes the process begins much earlier. The mind establishes a reference point first. Then reasoning happens around it. This doesn't mean we are helpless or incapable of correcting our judgments. We can question anchors. We can deliberately seek independent information. We can ask ourselves where our initial assumption came from. But noticing the anchor is often the first step. Because an invisible influence is difficult to challenge when you don't realize it's there. And perhaps the most unsettling question is this: how many of the things you consider valuable would feel different if they had been introduced to you differently? A 10,000 jacket can feel like a bargain at rupee 5,000. The same 5,000 jacket can feel expensive when placed beside one costing rupee 2,000. The number hasn't changed. The object hasn't changed. Only the reference point has moved. And if something as simple as a number can quietly influence what we think something is worth, imagine what happens when the object isn't merely something we're considering, but something we already believe belongs to us. Because once something becomes ours, our minds can begin valuing it differently. Even if, yesterday, we would barely have noticed it. That brings us to the strange psychological effect, known as the endowment effect. 8. The things we own feel more valuable. Imagine you're walking through a market and you see an ordinary coffee mug. You look at it. Maybe you like the design. Maybe you don't. The seller asks for 150. You think about it for a moment and decide it's not worth the money. Then imagine that, somehow, the same mug becomes yours. You've carried it home. You've used it for a few weeks. It sits quietly on your desk every morning. One day, someone offers you 150 for it. Suddenly, the decision feels different. Maybe you hesitate. Maybe you think, actually, I'd want at least 300 for that. Nothing about the mug has changed. The ceramic is the same. The design is the same. Its practical usefulness is the same. The only difference is that now it belongs to you. This is the endowment effect, a psychological tendency in which people can place greater value on something simply because they own it. Ownership changes the way an object is represented in the mind. Before we possess something, we might think about it as one option among many. After we possess it, the object becomes connected to the self. It becomes mine. And that tiny word can have surprisingly powerful psychological consequences. Think about the things around you right now. Perhaps there's an old shirt in your cupboard that you haven't worn for years. A book you haven't opened in a decade. A broken electronic device you keep telling yourself you'll repair. Logically, you might know that these things have little practical value. And yet, getting rid of them can feel strangely difficult. Sometimes the reason isn't usefulness. It's attachment. The object has become connected to memories, identity, routine, or a sense of personal history. Take a moment to reflect on that. There may be objects in your life that are valuable not because of what they are, but because of what they represent. A photograph, a handwritten note, an old gift, a childhood possession. Their financial value might be almost nothing. Their psychological value can be enormous. This is where the endowment effect becomes particularly fascinating. Ownership isn't always about legal possession. Our minds can develop a feeling of psychological ownership toward things we identify with, invest effort into, or feel connected to. And once something becomes part of our sense of mine, giving it up can feel like losing a small piece of ourselves. That connects the endowment effect to another powerful psychological tendency, loss aversion. We don't simply value what we have. We can also become unusually sensitive to the possibility of losing it. Imagine being offered a chance to gain rupee 500. Now imagine being told you might lose rupee 500. The numbers are identical, but emotionally they may not feel equal. The possibility of losing something can create a much stronger reaction than the possibility of gaining the same thing. And this reveals something deeply human. Our minds don't always measure value like calculators. We measure it through attachment, expectation, memory, and fear. Sometimes, the moment something becomes ours, we begin seeing it differently. Not because the object changed, because the relationship changed. And once we understand that, we can begin to see why losing something can hurt far more than gaining the same thing feels good. That strange imbalance is our next psychological effect. 9. Why losing hurts more than winning feels good. Imagine finding rupee 500 on the ground. You look around. No one seems to be searching for it. For a moment, you feel a small rush of excitement. You found something valuable. Now imagine the opposite. You reach into your pocket and realize you've lost rupee 500. The money is gone. Perhaps you retrace your steps. You check your bag. You search the ground. And even though the financial difference is exactly the same, the emotional experience feels completely different. This is the strange psychological tendency known as loss aversion. In simple terms, losses often feel more psychologically powerful than equivalent gains. The mind doesn't treat gaining and losing as two perfectly balanced sides of the same equation. A gain can feel pleasant. A loss can feel painful. And the pain of losing something may dominate our thoughts far more intensely than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value. Consider a simple choice. Someone offers you a guaranteed rupee 500. Then they offer another option. You could receive rupee 1000, but there is a chance you receive nothing. Suddenly, the decision becomes complicated. You aren't only thinking about what you might gain. You're thinking about what you might lose. And that possibility can become psychologically heavier than the potential reward. Loss aversion helps explain why people sometimes hold onto things long after those things stop serving them. An old possession, a disappointing investment, a familiar routine, even a situation that makes them unhappy. Leaving means giving something up, and the mind can react strongly to that imagined loss. Take a moment to reflect on how often the thought of losing something influences your decisions. Sometimes we don't ask, what would make my life better? Instead, we ask, what if I lose what I already have? Those are very different questions. And the second one can be much more emotionally powerful. This tendency may have deep roots in the way humans respond to uncertainty and potential threats. From an evolutionary perspective, failing to notice a potential loss could sometimes have serious consequences. Protecting something valuable could be more immediately important than pursuing an uncertain reward. But in modern life, that ancient sensitivity can sometimes work against us. We may fear losing comfort more than we desire growth. We may remain attached to something simply because leaving would feel like a loss. And there is another subtle consequence. Loss aversion can change the way we remember events. A missed opportunity can remain in the mind for years. A mistake can replay itself repeatedly. Something we didn't get can sometimes occupy more mental space than everything we did receive. The mind seems to whisper, "What if? What if you had chosen differently? What if you hadn't lost it? What if you had acted sooner?" Take a slow breath. Those questions can feel incredibly real, but they are questions about a version of reality that no longer exists. And perhaps that is one of the strangest things about loss. The event may be over, but the mind can continue experiencing it long afterward. Yet memory itself has another curious habit. It doesn't preserve every moment equally. Sometimes an entire experience can be remembered through only a few emotionally powerful moments, especially the most intense moment and the way everything ended. And that brings us to the peak end rule. 10. The ending can rewrite the experience. Imagine going on a beautiful vacation. For several days, everything goes well. The weather is pleasant. The food is good. You discover quiet streets, unfamiliar places, and little moments that you know you'll remember. Then, on the final evening, something goes wrong. Perhaps your flight is delayed for hours. Maybe you lose your luggage. Maybe there is an argument. Nothing about the earlier days changes. They still happened. But months later, when someone asks you about the trip, you might find yourself remembering it as disappointing. That is because human memory does not always evaluate an experience by carefully calculating every moment. Instead, our minds can place disproportionate weight on certain parts of an experience, particularly its most emotionally intense moment and its ending. This tendency is known as the peak end rule. Imagine listening to a piece of music. Most of it is pleasant. Then there is one beautiful section that gives you chills. And the song ends perfectly. When you later remember the experience, those moments may dominate your overall impression. The same thing can happen with conversations, meals, vacations, movies, medical procedures, and countless ordinary experiences. The mind doesn't necessarily preserve the complete emotional timeline. It creates a summary, and the summary can become the version we carry forward. This is one reason memory is so fascinating. We often imagine that remembering means replaying the past. But memory is not a video recording. It is closer to a story that the mind reconstructs. And stories have beginnings, important moments, and endings. Take a moment to think about a recent experience. Maybe it was an evening with friends. Maybe it was a difficult day at work. Maybe it was a long journey. How accurately does your current memory represent every minute of it? Probably not very accurately. You remember fragments, certain images, certain emotions, a conversation, a laugh, a moment of frustration, and perhaps the way the experience ended. Those fragments become the psychological version of the entire event. This can have surprisingly practical consequences. If a restaurant serves an excellent meal but ends the evening with terrible service, that final interaction may influence how you remember the entire visit. If a difficult project ends with a satisfying result, the ending may soften your memory of everything that came before it. The experience itself remains complex, but the memory becomes simpler. And perhaps there is something comforting about that. Our minds cannot carry every detail of every day. If they did, ordinary life would become impossibly heavy. So the brain compresses. It selects. It summarizes. It keeps certain moments and lets others fade. But that also means the past we remember is not necessarily identical to the past we experienced. Take a quiet moment here. Think about a memory that feels especially important to you. Now imagine all the tiny details that have disappeared from it. The exact sounds, the small pauses, the things nobody noticed, the ordinary seconds between the moments you remember. They are gone from conscious memory, but they were once part of the experience. And if our minds can reduce an entire event to a few meaningful moments, another strange question appears. What determines which moments survive? Sometimes it may be the position of an event. The beginning, the middle, the end. Because even something as simple as remembering a list of words can be influenced by where each word appears. And that leads us to the serial position effect. 11. Why you remember the first and last things. Imagine someone reading 20 words to you slowly, one after another. You listen carefully. The first word is something simple. The second is easy to remember. Then the list continues. By the time you reach the middle, the words begin blending together. Finally, the last few words arrive. And when the list ends, you are asked to remember as many as possible. Something strange happens. You may remember several words from the beginning. You may also remember several from the end. But the middle can feel strangely empty. This tendency is known as the serial position effect, a psychological phenomenon showing that the position of information within a sequence can influence how well we remember it. Two related effects help explain this pattern. The primacy effect refers to our tendency to remember items near the beginning of a sequence relatively well. The recency effect describes our tendency to remember items near the end. At first, this might seem like a small curiosity, but it reveals something important about how memory works. Imagine the beginning of a conversation. You have just started paying attention. Your mind has fewer competing pieces of information. The first few details have more opportunity to be processed and stored. As the conversation continues, more information arrives. Some of it competes with what came before. Then, near the end, the most recent information may still be active in working memory. So the beginning and ending can receive different kinds of psychological advantages. Take a moment to reflect on how often this might happen in ordinary life. When you meet someone for the first time, their first impression can become surprisingly influential. When someone gives you a list of instructions, you may remember what they said first and what they said most recently. When you listen to a speech, certain opening and closing statements may remain with you longer than everything in between. The middle hasn't necessarily been unimportant. It may simply have been squeezed between two different memory advantages. And this raises a fascinating question. Why does the mind organize information this way? One answer is that memory has limited capacity. Your brain cannot treat every piece of incoming information as equally important, equally vivid, and equally accessible. It has to prioritize. The result is not a perfectly even recording. It is a system shaped by attention, repetition, timing, and mental availability. And there is another strange consequence. Sometimes the way information is arranged can influence what we believe we remember. The order of events becomes part of the memory itself. The first thing can establish a frame. The final thing can become the last impression. And the middle may quietly fade. Take a slow breath. Think about a long conversation you had recently. Can you remember every sentence? Probably not. But perhaps you remember how it began. And perhaps you remember exactly how it ended. Those moments can become anchors for the entire experience. Which brings us to another peculiar feature of the mind. Sometimes it isn't simply information at the beginning or end that stays with us. Sometimes it is the thing that remains unfinished. A task left incomplete. A message left unanswered. A sentence interrupted halfway through. For some reason, the mind can have difficulty closing the door on something that never quite reached an ending. And that brings us to the Zeigarnik effect. 12. The unfinished thought that won't leave. Imagine you're getting ready for bed after a long day. Most of your work is finished. The emails have been answered. The dishes are done. You've turned off the lights. And yet, there is one small thing you didn't complete. Perhaps you forgot to send an important message. Maybe there's a task waiting on your desk tomorrow. Nothing is happening right now. But somehow, that unfinished task keeps returning to your thoughts. You think about it while brushing your teeth. You remember it when you get into bed. You tell yourself you'll deal with it tomorrow. And then 10 minutes later, there it is again. That strange persistence is connected to what psychologists call the Zeigarnik effect. The basic idea is that unfinished or interrupted tasks can sometimes remain more mentally accessible than completed ones. It's as though the mind has difficulty closing an open loop. Imagine your attention as a room with several doors. When you complete something, one door closes. You no longer need to keep actively monitoring it. But when something remains unresolved, the door stays slightly open. Part of your mind continues to hold it. This doesn't mean that every unfinished task will constantly occupy your thoughts. The effect depends on many factors, including how important the task is, how motivated you are, and whether you have a clear plan for completing it. Still, the underlying idea is fascinating. Sometimes completion gives us psychological relief beyond the practical value of actually finishing the task. Take a moment to reflect on the kinds of thoughts that tend to return when everything else becomes quiet. A conversation you never finished. A question you never answered. A decision you postponed. A project you abandoned halfway through. An apology you never gave. These things can linger because they have no clear ending. And sometimes the mind continues revisiting them because it is trying to resolve uncertainty. This may also explain why writing down unfinished tasks can feel surprisingly calming. Once the brain knows there is a plan, the open loop may become easier to set aside. The task hasn't disappeared, but the uncertainty surrounding it has changed. There is now a place for it. And perhaps that is an important distinction. Our minds don't necessarily need everything to be completed immediately. Sometimes they simply need to know what happens next. But there is a darker side to unfinished thoughts. Some open loops are not tasks. They are worries. A conversation that ended badly. A mistake we keep replaying. A possibility we cannot resolve. And when the mind has nothing else demanding its attention, these unresolved thoughts can become louder. The quiet of the night can make them feel especially powerful. Yet sometimes the thought that occupies us most isn't even an unfinished one. It is a negative one. A criticism. A mistake. A frightening possibility. One unpleasant moment that somehow seems louder than 10 pleasant ones. Why does the mind give negative information so much attention? Perhaps because, from the brain's perspective, ignoring a possible threat can be more costly than overlooking something pleasant. And that brings us to our next strange psychological effect. The mind's remarkable tendency to remember the darkness more easily than the light. The negativity bias. 13. The mind's darker filter. Imagine someone says 10 wonderful things about you. They tell you that you're thoughtful, reliable, funny, kind. They mention how much they appreciate having you around. You leave the conversation feeling good. Then, almost casually, they add one criticism. Maybe they say you sometimes speak too quickly. Maybe they question one decision you made. Maybe it's something small. You continue with your day. But hours later, what do you find yourself thinking about? The criticism. That single negative sentence can echo through your mind, while the 10 positive ones slowly fade into the background. This tendency is known as negativity bias. It describes the tendency for negative information, experiences, and events to attract more attention and sometimes carry greater psychological weight than equally strong positive information. In other words, the mind doesn't always treat good news and bad news as equal. And there may be a reason for that. Imagine an ancient human walking through a forest. They notice beautiful flowers. They hear birds. They feel the warmth of the sunlight. All of those things are pleasant. Then they hear a sudden movement behind a bush. Their attention changes immediately. The pleasant details become less important. Something might be wrong. From a survival perspective, that makes sense. Failing to notice a potential threat could have serious consequences. Failing to notice something beautiful probably wouldn't. So the human brain developed systems that are highly sensitive to potential danger. The strange part is that we still carry those systems into a world that is often far less immediately dangerous. A critical email can trigger the same intense attention that a compliment does not. An embarrassing memory can replay for years. One alarming headline can capture our attention while dozens of ordinary, reassuring facts barely register. Take a moment to notice how this works in your own experience. If someone tells you that everything went well today except for one awkward conversation, which part is your mind most likely to revisit when you're lying in bed? The awkward conversation. Perhaps you replay the exact words. Maybe you imagine what you should have said. You may even create alternative versions of the moment. Meanwhile, all the ordinary moments where nothing went wrong disappear almost completely. This doesn't mean that human beings are naturally pessimistic. It means that negative information can receive priority. And sometimes that priority is useful. It can help us learn from mistakes. It can make us cautious. It can help us recognize danger. But when the system becomes too dominant, it can distort our sense of reality. One bad experience can make an entire day feel bad. One rejection can make us forget years of acceptance. One mistake can become the story we tell ourselves about who we are. The mind's protective filter can therefore become strangely convincing. And once something negative captures our attention, another psychological tendency may begin. We start looking for evidence that supports the story already forming in our minds. If we believe someone dislikes us, we notice their cold expression. If we believe we're failing, we notice every mistake. Evidence that contradicts the belief may quietly disappear from attention. This is where negativity bias begins to meet another powerful force: confirmation bias. And that is where our next journey begins. 14. The evidence we want to find. Imagine you have a quiet suspicion that someone doesn't like you. They haven't said anything directly. There is no clear evidence. But one afternoon, you send them a message. They don't respond for several hours. Immediately, your mind notices. See, maybe they really don't like me. Later that evening, they finally reply. Their message is warm. They ask how you're doing. They even make a joke. For a moment, your original suspicion seems less convincing. But perhaps you barely think about it. The delayed response remains in your memory. The friendly message fades. This is a simple example of confirmation bias, the tendency to notice, interpret, and remember information in ways that support beliefs we already hold. And the strange thing is that this usually doesn't require us to consciously lie to ourselves. The mind can do it quietly. Imagine you are wearing a pair of tinted glasses. The world hasn't changed, but everything you see is subtly colored by the lenses. Confirmation bias can work in a similar way. Once we form a belief, expectation, or assumption, information that agrees with it can become easier to notice. Information that contradicts it may require more effort to recognize. This can happen with opinions, relationships, politics, work, health decisions, and even beliefs about ourselves. Suppose you believe you're bad at meeting new people. You introduce yourself to someone and the conversation feels awkward. Your mind stores that moment as evidence. But later, you have a pleasant conversation with someone else. That may not receive the same psychological attention. Soon, the belief becomes stronger. I'm just not good with people. The belief then influences what you notice next time. And the cycle continues. Take a moment to reflect on how powerful that loop can become. A belief influences attention. Attention influences what we remember. Memory strengthens the belief. The stronger belief influences attention again. It can feel as though reality is repeatedly proving you right. But sometimes, what is actually happening is that your mind has become very good at finding the evidence it expects. This doesn't mean that our beliefs are always wrong. Sometimes our assumptions are accurate. Sometimes people really are behaving in a certain way. The important point is that certainty is not the same thing as objectivity. We can be correct for reasons that have little to do with how confident we feel. And this becomes especially interesting when the belief is about ourselves. Perhaps you believe you're naturally intelligent. Perhaps you believe you're terrible at mathematics. Perhaps you think you're unlucky. Perhaps you see yourself as someone who always makes the wrong decision. These beliefs can become invisible filters through which future experiences are interpreted. And the more familiar the belief becomes, the more difficult it can be to notice the filter itself. Take a slow breath. Ask yourself, what evidence would convince me that I might be wrong? It's a surprisingly difficult question, because the mind doesn't always search for truth in a completely neutral way. Sometimes it searches for consistency. And that leads to another strange psychological phenomenon. There are moments when our confidence in what we know can be much greater than our actual understanding. Sometimes, the less we understand a complicated subject, the less aware we are of how much we don't know. And that brings us to the fascinating world of the Dunning-Kruger effect. 15. The confidence of not knowing. Imagine someone explaining a complicated subject with complete confidence. They speak quickly. They use technical words. They seem certain about every detail. Listening to them, you might assume they understand the subject deeply. But then you ask a simple question, and suddenly the explanation begins to fall apart. This points toward a fascinating idea in psychology. Sometimes, people with limited knowledge or skill in a particular area can struggle to recognize the limits of their own understanding. This phenomenon is commonly associated with the Dunning-Kruger effect. The idea comes from research into metacognition, which is essentially the ability to evaluate your own knowledge and performance. And this distinction is important. The Dunning-Kruger effect is often reduced to a simple joke. People who know the least think they know the most. But that isn't really the full idea. The deeper concept is more subtle. When you don't know very much about something, you may also lack the knowledge necessary to recognize what you're missing. Imagine standing at the edge of a forest you've never explored. From where you're standing, it looks relatively small. You can see the trees near the entrance. You might even think you understand the entire landscape. But after walking deeper into it, you discover hills, rivers, hidden paths, and enormous stretches of land you couldn't see from the beginning. Learning can work the same way. At first, a subject can seem simple. Then you learn more. And suddenly, you realize how complicated it actually is. Take a moment to reflect on that. Have you ever learned just enough about something to feel like you understood it completely? Then, after going deeper, discovered that the subject was far more complicated than you imagined. This is one reason genuine expertise can sometimes look surprisingly modest. The more someone understands, the more clearly they may see the boundaries of their knowledge. A skilled scientist can say, "We don't know." An experienced professional can say, "I'm not certain." Someone who has spent years studying a subject may become more aware of the questions that remain unanswered. That doesn't mean experts always doubt themselves. And it doesn't mean beginners are always overconfident. The important lesson is that confidence and competence are separate things. You can feel certain and still be mistaken. You can feel uncertain and still be correct. And this matters far beyond academic subjects. We make judgments about relationships, work, money, people, and ourselves. Sometimes we don't realize how much we don't know because we don't yet know what questions to ask. Perhaps that is one of the most humbling things about intelligence. Real understanding doesn't simply give us more answers. It can also reveal more questions. The horizon expands, and the farther you travel toward it, the more distant it seems. But there is another problem with the mind that is perhaps even stranger. We can be uncertain about the future. We can misunderstand the present. And yet we often feel remarkably confident about the past. We remember conversations. We remember faces. We remember where we were when something happened. The memory can feel vivid and unquestionable. But what if vividness isn't proof of accuracy? What if remembering something is not like replaying a recording, but rebuilding a story? That brings us to the mysterious world of false memories. 16. The memory that never happened. Imagine remembering a moment from your childhood. Perhaps you can picture the room. You remember the color of the walls. You can almost hear the voices around you. Maybe you even remember what you were wearing. The memory feels complete, solid, real. Now imagine discovering that one detail in that memory could never have happened. Maybe someone who you remember being there was actually somewhere else. Maybe the location was different. Perhaps the photograph you've been remembering doesn't exist. And suddenly, you are left with a strange question. If a memory feels completely real, how can you know that every part of it is accurate? This is where false memories become fascinating. A false memory is a recollection of something that did not happen in exactly the way we remember it, or in some cases, something that did not happen at all. This doesn't mean that memory is useless. Most of the time, our memories are good enough to help us navigate life. But memory is not a perfect recording system. When you remember something, your brain isn't opening a file and playing it back exactly as it was stored. It is reconstructing the event. Imagine an old photograph that has been folded many times. Each time you unfold it, you can still recognize the picture. But small details may gradually become harder to distinguish. Memory can be somewhat similar. We remember the general structure, the emotions, the important details. Other information can fade. Later experiences, conversations, assumptions, and suggestions can sometimes become woven into the reconstruction. Take a moment to think about a memory you are particularly confident about. Now consider something strange. How confident would you be if someone asked you to describe every tiny detail? Where exactly was everyone standing? What time was it? What was said immediately before and after? What was the weather like? Often certainty becomes weaker as we move from the broad outline toward the smallest details. Yet emotionally vivid memories can feel exceptionally trustworthy. That is part of what makes false memories so unsettling. The feeling of remembering something and the accuracy of remembering it are not necessarily the same thing. This matters in everyday life. Two people can remember the same conversation differently. A family can tell different versions of the same childhood event. A person can sincerely remember saying something that another person sincerely remembers never hearing. Neither person necessarily has to be lying. They may simply be reconstructing the past differently. And perhaps this reveals something beautiful as well as unsettling. Memory isn't only about preserving information. It helps create our sense of identity. We use memories to tell ourselves where we came from. We connect childhood to adulthood. We connect yesterday to today. Without that continuity, the feeling of being the same person across time would become much harder to understand. But the story of the past is never perfectly frozen. It can be revised, reinterpreted, filled in, sometimes even quietly altered. And if the mind can change the way we remember the past, there is another dimension it can change just as dramatically. Our experience of the present can also distort something that seems completely objective. Time. A minute on a clock is always 60 seconds. But psychologically, 1 minute can feel endless, or disappear almost instantly. And that brings us to the strange way the mind experiences time. 17. Why time speeds up. Think back to when you were a child. A summer vacation could feel enormous. A school year seemed to stretch endlessly into the distance. Waiting for your birthday felt almost impossible. Then somehow, adulthood arrived. Now a month can disappear. A season can pass before you realize it. And sometimes, you look back and wonder how an entire year managed to vanish so quickly. The strange thing is that the clock hasn't changed. A minute is still a minute. An hour is still an hour. Yet psychological time can feel completely different from clock time. Our experience of time is influenced by attention, emotion, novelty, memory, and the amount of distinctive information we encounter. Think about waiting for an important message. You check your phone. 1 minute passes. You check again. Another minute. It can feel strangely long. Now imagine becoming completely absorbed in a conversation with someone you enjoy. You look at the clock later and think, how is it already this late? The same 60 minutes have passed. But your experience of those 60 minutes is completely different. Attention plays a major role. When we constantly monitor time, we become more aware of its passage. When our attention is absorbed elsewhere, the clock can seem to disappear. But there is another fascinating distinction. The way time feels while we're experiencing it isn't always the same as the way we remember it afterward. A repetitive day can feel slow while it is happening. But months later, that period may seem to have disappeared almost completely from memory. Why? Because routine creates fewer distinctive memories. If every day follows the same pattern, your brain has fewer unique landmarks to separate one day from another. But imagine traveling somewhere completely unfamiliar. Every street looks different. Every meal is new. Every sound and smell catches your attention. Later, that short trip may feel much longer in memory because it contains so many distinct experiences. Take a moment to reflect on the past year. How many moments can you clearly distinguish? There may be a handful of vivid memories. A particular conversation. A journey. A celebration. A difficult day. A surprising moment. But between those memories are countless ordinary hours that have blended together. Perhaps this is one reason childhood can seem so long in retrospect. When you're young, the world contains an enormous amount of novelty. A new school, a new neighborhood, a new friend, a new experience. Everything creates another landmark in memory. As we grow older, routines can become more established. The unfamiliar becomes familiar, and the years can seem to compress. This isn't simply a trick of perception. It is a reminder that our experience of time is deeply connected to what we notice and remember. The clock measures duration. The mind creates meaning from it. And perhaps that gives us a quiet reason to seek moments of attention and novelty. Not because we can literally slow time down, but because we can make our experience of it richer and more memorable. A single evening can contain only a few hours, but those hours can become a memory that feels much larger. And if the mind can stretch and compress our experience of time, it can do something even stranger. It can allow an event that hasn't happened yet to influence how we feel right now. A future vacation. An upcoming conversation. Tomorrow's possibilities. The future doesn't exist yet. And yet we can already feel it. That brings us to anticipation. 18. The future can change the present. Imagine that you have booked a vacation several weeks from now. The trip hasn't happened. You haven't packed your bags. You haven't arrived at the destination. You haven't seen the places you're imagining. And yet something has already changed. You wake up on an ordinary Tuesday, but you know that somewhere ahead of you, a few days of rest are waiting. Suddenly, the present feels slightly different. You might find yourself thinking about the journey while working. You imagine what you'll see. You picture the food. You wonder what the weather will be like. Nothing has happened yet, but the future has already entered your mind. This is the strange power of anticipation. Human beings don't simply react to what is happening now. We constantly simulate what might happen next. Our minds create possible futures and use those imagined scenarios to influence how we feel in the present. Think about waiting for an important phone call. The call hasn't arrived, but your body may already feel tense. You imagine what the person might say. You prepare possible responses. You wonder how the conversation will go. The future is technically unknown, yet your brain is already rehearsing it. This ability is incredibly useful. It allows us to plan. We can imagine consequences before acting. We can prepare for challenges. We can look forward to rewarding experiences. But there is a strange limitation. Our predictions about the future are not always accurate. We can be remarkably confident that something will make us happy, only to discover that the actual experience feels surprisingly ordinary. We can also expect something terrible and later realize that we handled it much better than we imagined. Psychologists sometimes describe this as effective forecasting, our attempts to predict what we will feel in the future. And we are not always very good at it. Take a moment to think about something you once desperately wanted. Perhaps you imagined that getting it would completely transform your life. Then, after you finally got it, the excitement slowly became normal. The object remained. The feeling changed. This happens because humans are remarkably adaptable. What feels extraordinary today can become ordinary tomorrow. And yet, anticipation can still be powerful. Sometimes, the imagined future is enough to change the present. A future reward can make a difficult task feel easier. A future threat can make an ordinary moment feel tense. An appointment next week can occupy your thoughts today. The mind is constantly moving between what is happening and what might happen. In that sense, imagination becomes a kind of psychological time machine. We can visit possible futures without physically going anywhere. But there is another fascinating detail. The future we imagine isn't created from nothing. Our expectations are built from previous experiences, memories, assumptions, and patterns. If something went badly before, we may expect it to go badly again. If something went well, we may expect the same pattern to continue. So the past helps construct the future we imagine. And those expectations can then influence how we perceive the present. If you expect a room to be uncomfortable, you may notice every uncomfortable detail. If you expect someone to be friendly, you may interpret their behavior more generously. Our predictions don't just tell us what might happen. Sometimes they influence what we notice happening. And that leads naturally to our next strange psychological effect. Because the brain doesn't simply wait for sensory information and then interpret it. It is constantly making predictions about what it expects to see. Sometimes those expectations can become so powerful that they change what we think we're actually perceiving. The world arrives at our senses, but the mind is already preparing an answer. And that is where expectation and perception begin to blur. 19. Seeing what you expected to see. Imagine walking into a dark room late at night. You know you're alone. At least you think you are. Then, in the corner of your vision, something moves. Your heart jumps. You look toward the object. For a second, the coat hanging from a chair looks remarkably like a person. Then you turn on the light. It's only a coat. Nothing in the room actually transformed. What changed was your interpretation of what you were seeing. This is an example of how expectations can influence perception. We often imagine that our senses work like cameras. Light enters the eyes. Sound enters the ears. Information travels to the brain. And the brain simply reports what is there. But perception is more complicated. The brain is constantly making predictions about the world. It combines incoming sensory information with memories, expectations, context, and previous experience. In other words, we don't simply receive information. We interpret it. Imagine hearing someone say a sentence in a noisy room. At first, the words are difficult to understand. Then someone tells you what they said. Suddenly, the same sounds become much clearer. The sound itself may not have changed significantly. Your expectation changed the way you interpreted it. This is sometimes described through the idea of top-down processing, where higher-level knowledge and expectations influence how sensory information is understood. Take a moment to reflect on how often this might happen during an ordinary day. If you're expecting someone to arrive, a movement outside the window might catch your attention. If you're expecting bad news, an ambiguous message may immediately feel threatening. If you believe someone is angry with you, their neutral expression might seem unusually cold. The information reaching your senses may be incomplete. Your brain fills in the gaps. Most of the time, this is useful. The world is noisy. Sensory information is often incomplete. If the brain had to analyze every detail from scratch, perception would become incredibly slow. Instead, it uses predictions. It makes educated guesses. It asks, in effect, what is most likely happening here? And then it compares that prediction with incoming information. When the prediction is correct, perception feels effortless. When the prediction is wrong, the brain updates. But occasionally, the prediction can become strong enough to distort interpretation. A shadow becomes a person. A harmless expression becomes anger. A vague sound becomes a familiar voice. The mind isn't necessarily trying to deceive you. It's trying to make sense of incomplete information as quickly as possible. And perhaps this explains why two people can encounter the same ambiguous situation and walk away with completely different impressions. Their eyes may have received similar information. Their minds may have interpreted it differently. Take a slow breath. Consider the possibility that perception is not simply a picture of the world. It is a conversation between the world and everything your brain already knows about it. Your expectations speak first. The senses answer. Then the brain adjusts the story. And sometimes, that story becomes so convincing that the body reacts before you have consciously decided what you believe. A frightening thought can make your heart beat faster. An imagined conversation can make your stomach tighten. A memory can bring tears to your eyes, even though the event happened years ago. The thought itself becomes enough to create a physical response. And that brings us to our next strange psychological effect. The remarkable way the body can respond to a thought as though the thought were actually happening. 20. The body that believes the thought. Imagine that you're lying quietly in bed at night. Nothing is happening. The room is still. Your body is relaxed. Then, for some reason, you remember an embarrassing moment from years ago. Maybe you said something awkward in front of other people. Maybe you made a mistake at work. Maybe you simply remember a moment when you wished you could disappear. The event is over. It happened long ago. And yet, as you remember it, something changes. Your face becomes warm. Your stomach tightens. Your shoulders tense. Perhaps your heart beats a little faster. Nothing has physically happened to you, but your body has reacted anyway. This reveals something fascinating about the relationship between thoughts, emotions, and the body. Our physical responses are not triggered only by events happening in the outside world. They can also be triggered by how the brain interprets what is happening. A thought can carry meaning, and meaning can activate the body's response systems. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff. Your body may become alert immediately. Your heart beats faster. Your muscles tense. Your attention narrows. Now imagine standing safely on the ground and vividly picturing yourself standing on that same cliff. You know you're safe. But if the mental image is strong enough, you might still feel a small surge of tension. The image is imaginary. The reaction can be real. This is partly because the brain is constantly evaluating situations for significance. It doesn't simply ask whether something is physically happening. It also asks what the situation means. A memory can mean danger. A thought can mean embarrassment. An imagined future can mean uncertainty. A reassuring voice can mean safety. And the body responds to those interpretations. Take a moment to notice your own breathing. Without changing it, simply observe it. Now imagine receiving wonderful news. Perhaps something you've been waiting for finally worked out. Notice how easily your body might respond to the thought. Your expression changes. Your chest feels lighter. Your posture shifts. Now imagine receiving terrible news. Even without knowing exactly what the news is, the thought alone may create tension. This connection between mind and body is one reason emotions can feel so physical. Fear isn't just a thought. It can be a racing heart. Embarrassment isn't just an idea. It can be warmth in the face. Anxiety isn't simply a sentence inside the mind. It can be muscle tension, restlessness, or changes in breathing. The body and mind are not two completely separate systems having a conversation from opposite sides of a room. They are deeply interconnected. And that connection can work in both directions. Our thoughts can influence bodily sensations, but bodily sensations can also influence how we interpret what we are feeling. A tense body may make a situation seem more threatening. A relaxed body can make the same situation seem more manageable. This is why simply noticing physical sensations can sometimes change our relationship with an emotion. We don't necessarily have to fight the feeling. We can observe it. My heart is beating faster. My shoulders are tense. My breathing has changed. Take a slow breath. The sensation is real, but the story surrounding it may be something the mind is creating. And this brings us to an even stranger phenomenon. Sometimes the body can respond to an expectation of improvement, even when the treatment itself contains no active ingredient. A belief, a ritual, a reassuring explanation. A small change in expectation can sometimes alter the experience of discomfort. The mind can influence the body in ways that are difficult to see from the outside. And that leads us to the mysterious placebo effect. 21. When belief changes the experience. Imagine you're sitting in a quiet clinic, waiting for a treatment. A doctor or medical professional explains that what you're about to receive may help reduce your discomfort. You take the treatment. You wait. And after some time, you notice that you feel better. Now imagine discovering later that what you received contained no active medicinal ingredient. At first, that sounds impossible. If there was no active drug, how could anything have changed? Yet the phenomenon points towards something fascinating about the relationship between expectation, context, and the brain. This is known as the placebo effect. In simple terms, placebo responses can occur when expectations, conditioning, treatment rituals, and other contextual factors influence how a person experiences symptoms or responds to an intervention. It is important to be precise here. The placebo effect does not mean that simply believing something can magically cure every illness. It does not mean serious diseases disappear through positive thinking. Instead, the phenomenon shows that our expectations and the context surrounding treatment can influence certain aspects of our experience, particularly things such as perceived pain, discomfort, nausea, and other subjective symptoms. Imagine the difference between taking a mysterious pill from an unknown source and receiving a treatment from someone you trust. The physical object may be similar, but the meaning surrounding it is completely different. There is a room, a professional, a ritual, an explanation, a sense that something is being done to help you. All of those details can become part of the experience. Take a moment to reflect on how often context influences you. A meal can taste better when you're somewhere beautiful. A familiar song can feel more emotional when it reminds you of someone. A glass of water can feel strangely comforting when someone offers it at exactly the moment you're thirsty. The object itself is only part of the experience. The meaning we attach to it matters too. Placebo research reveals something similar. The brain doesn't experience a treatment in isolation. It interprets the treatment through expectations and previous experiences. If you've learned that a certain ritual is associated with relief, the ritual itself may become psychologically meaningful. This is one reason the placebo effect is so fascinating. The expectation doesn't necessarily need to be consciously analyzed. The body can respond to learned associations and contextual cues without you deliberately deciding to respond. And there is an important distinction between placebo effects and simply imagining that you're better. Someone can experience a genuine change in how a symptom feels even though the underlying condition has not necessarily changed. Pain, for example, is not simply a measurement coming directly from damaged tissue. It is also an experience constructed through complex interactions between the nervous system, attention, emotion, expectations, and context. That makes the mind-body relationship even more mysterious. Take a slow breath. Consider how many experiences in your life are shaped by what you expect them to mean. A doctor's words, a familiar environment, a comforting voice, a ritual you've repeated many times. The mind is constantly interpreting context, and sometimes that context becomes part of what you experience. But context doesn't only influence treatments. It can change how we experience ordinary objects, places, food, conversations, and even people. The same thing can feel completely different depending on what surrounds it. A cup of coffee at home can feel ordinary. The same coffee beside a rainy window in a quiet cafe can feel almost magical. Nothing about the coffee has necessarily changed. The context has. And that brings us to our next strange psychological effect. The context that changes everything. 22. The context that changes everything. Imagine drinking a cup of coffee in your kitchen on an ordinary morning. It's familiar. Perhaps you're standing beside the counter, looking at the clock, thinking about everything you need to do. The coffee tastes fine. Nothing remarkable. Now imagine drinking that same coffee somewhere completely different. Perhaps you're sitting beside a quiet window while rain falls outside. The lights are soft. There is gentle music in the background. You have nowhere you need to be for the next hour. You take another sip. Suddenly, the coffee feels different. Maybe it tastes richer. Maybe the moment feels more peaceful. But here's the strange part. The coffee itself may be exactly the same. What changed was everything around it. This reveals the powerful role of context in perception and judgment. Our minds rarely evaluate things in complete isolation. Instead, we interpret experiences using the information surrounding them. The environment, our expectations, our mood, the people nearby, what happened immediately beforehand, even the comparisons we make. All of these factors can influence what something means to us. Think about food. The same meal can feel completely different depending on whether you're eating it alone, celebrating with friends, or rushing through a stressful day. The ingredients haven't changed, but the experience has. Context becomes part of perception. This happens with objects too. A painting hanging in an empty room may seem ordinary. Place it inside a prestigious gallery, beneath careful lighting, surrounded by descriptions about its history, and your perception may shift. You begin looking differently. You search for meaning. You notice details you might otherwise have ignored. Take a moment to reflect on how often your surroundings influence your interpretation of an experience. A person's tone can seem friendly when you're already in a good mood. The same tone might feel cold when you're irritated. A message can seem harmless when you trust the sender. The same words can feel threatening when you're already uncertain about their intentions. Context doesn't necessarily create the entire experience, but it helps shape the meaning your brain assigns to it. And this becomes even more interesting when we consider comparison. Imagine being offered a 500 product after first seeing one priced at Rupee 5,000. It may suddenly seem inexpensive, but show the same 500 product beside something costing Rupee 200, and it may feel expensive. The product hasn't changed. The reference point has. Context quietly changes the frame through which we judge. This is why two people can experience the same event and describe it differently. They don't arrive with identical histories. They don't carry the same expectations. They don't have the same memories. They don't occupy the same emotional state. So the same external event can produce different internal experiences. Take a slow breath. Think about the room around you right now. Notice how its meaning might change depending on your mood. A quiet room can feel peaceful. The same quiet room can feel lonely. The physical environment hasn't necessarily changed. Your interpretation has. And there is something deeply human about this. We don't experience isolated objects. We experience relationships between things. A sound and the silence around it. A person and the situation they're in. A memory and the emotion attached to it. A moment and what we expected it to become. The world provides the ingredients. The mind helps assemble the experience. But there is another influence, even more powerful than the room we're standing in. Other people, their expressions, their reactions, their expectations, their behavior. Sometimes, simply seeing what everyone else is doing can make us question our own perception. And that leads us into the strange psychological pressure of conformity. 23. The quiet pressure of other people. Imagine sitting in a waiting room with several strangers. Everyone is quiet. Then suddenly, someone looks toward the ceiling. A second person follows. Then another. You glance upward too. You don't know what they're looking at. Perhaps there is nothing there. But for a moment, you feel an almost automatic urge to look. This is a simple example of social conformity. Humans are deeply influenced by the people around them, often without realizing it. We tend to think of conformity as something dramatic. A crowd chanting. A group pressuring someone to behave in a certain way. A person changing their opinion because everyone else disagrees. But social influence can be much quieter. Sometimes it is simply the feeling that everyone else knows something you don't. Imagine walking into a restaurant you've never visited. There are 2 restaurants nearby. One is completely empty. The other is crowded. Without knowing anything about the food, service, or prices, you may instinctively feel that the busy restaurant is probably better. The crowd becomes information. You think, if all these people chose this place, they must know something. This is sometimes called informational social influence. When a situation is uncertain, we can look to other people for clues about what is happening. And that makes sense. If everyone suddenly starts running, you probably won't calmly continue walking without first wondering what they know. Other people's behavior can provide useful information. But there is another side. Sometimes we conform not because we believe the group is correct, but because we don't want to feel different. This is normative social influence. We want to belong. We want to avoid rejection. We want to feel socially safe. Take a moment to reflect on how often this might happen in ordinary life. The way you dress. The words you use. The foods you eat. The opinions you express. Even the things you pretend to enjoy. Some of these choices may genuinely reflect your preferences. Others may be influenced, at least partly, by the people around you. The strange part is that social influence doesn't always feel like pressure. Sometimes it feels like common sense. If everyone around you believes something, disagreement can suddenly feel uncomfortable. You may begin wondering whether you're the one who misunderstood. And if enough people behave as though something is true, the feeling of certainty can become surprisingly powerful. But groups can also be wrong. A crowd can confidently move in the wrong direction. A popular belief can remain popular simply because everyone assumes everyone else believes it. This creates a strange psychological loop. People look to others for confirmation. Others look back at them. Everyone sees agreement. And the agreement itself becomes evidence that the belief must be correct. Take a slow breath. Think about how much of your understanding of the world comes from other people. You learned words from other people. You learned social rules from other people. You learned what is considered normal by observing other people. Human beings are social creatures, and that social nature is one of our greatest strengths. But it also means that our individual minds are never completely isolated. Even when you're alone, the expectations of other people can remain inside your thoughts. You might rehearse what to say. Imagine how someone will react. Change your behavior because you are picturing their judgment. In a sense, the social world can follow you into an empty room. And that leads to our next strange psychological effect. Sometimes you don't need an actual audience at all. Your imagination can create one. A silent audience that watches, judges, and reacts to almost everything you do. And that brings us to the invisible audience. 24. The invisible audience. Imagine you're alone in your room. There is nobody watching you. Nobody is listening. Nobody knows what you're doing. And yet, you suddenly catch yourself practicing a conversation. Perhaps you're preparing what to say to someone tomorrow. You imagine their response. Then you imagine your own reply. Maybe you even change your expression or posture as you rehearse the conversation in your mind. It's strange. There is no audience. But somehow you are performing. This connects to the psychological idea of the imagined audience, the tendency to imagine that other people are paying attention to us, evaluating us, or forming opinions about our behavior. The phenomenon is particularly associated with adolescence, when awareness of how one appears to others can become especially intense, but some degree of self-consciousness continues throughout adult life. Think about how differently you might behave if you knew that someone was watching you. You might sit differently. You might speak more carefully. You might choose different words. You might become more aware of your facial expressions. Now consider something even stranger. Sometimes simply imagining that someone could be watching is enough to change your behavior. The imagined observer doesn't have to be physically present. Your brain can simulate them. Take a moment to reflect on how often you do this without realizing it. You send a message and immediately wonder how it sounded. You say something in a group and replay it later. You choose an outfit and imagine what other people might think. You walk into a room and become suddenly aware of how you're moving. These moments can feel intensely personal, but they're built around a basic human ability, perspective-taking. We can imagine ourselves from someone else's point of view. That ability is incredibly useful. It helps us cooperate. It helps us understand social expectations. It helps us avoid hurting other people. It allows us to imagine how our actions might affect someone else. But there is a strange cost. Because once we become capable of imagining other people's perspectives, we can also become overly concerned with them. The imagined audience can become much larger than the real one. A tiny mistake becomes a performance. A pause becomes embarrassing. A facial expression becomes evidence of judgment. And just like the spotlight effect, this can make us overestimate how much other people are thinking about us. The truth is that most people are occupied with their own internal worlds. They're thinking about their own conversations, their own appearance, their own mistakes, their own plans for tomorrow. The audience we imagine may be far more attentive than the real audience ever is. Take a slow breath. Think about how much energy can be spent trying to control an impression that exists primarily inside another person's imagined mind. Sometimes we aren't responding to what someone actually thinks. We are responding to what we think they might think. That is several layers of interpretation removed from reality. And yet it can feel completely real. But there is another fascinating problem with how we understand other people's behavior. When someone else makes a mistake, we often explain it by pointing toward their personality. They're careless. They're rude. They're selfish. But when we make the same mistake, suddenly we have a reason. We were tired, distracted, stressed, unawares. The action is similar. The explanation changes depending on who performed it. And that brings us to the fundamental attribution error. 25. We judge others by their actions, ourselves by our circumstances. Imagine you're walking down a quiet street when someone suddenly cuts in front of you. You almost bump into them. Your first thought might be simple. How rude. Perhaps you imagine they're inconsiderate. Maybe they're impatient. Maybe they're the kind of person who simply doesn't care about anyone else. Now imagine the situation is reversed. You're the one who accidentally cuts someone off. Your explanation is probably different. You were distracted. You didn't see them. Maybe you were in a hurry. Perhaps something was bothering you. The behavior is almost identical. But the story we tell about it changes depending on who is responsible. This is related to the fundamental attribution error, a tendency to place too much emphasis on someone's personal characteristics when explaining their behavior while underestimating the influence of the situation around them. In simple terms, we often explain other people's behavior by asking what kind of person they are. But when explaining our own behavior, we are more likely to consider what was happening around us. Imagine someone arriving late to a meeting. You might think they're irresponsible. But if you arrive late yourself, you remember the traffic, the delayed train, the unexpected phone call, the 10 other things that happened that morning. Suddenly, being late isn't evidence of your character. It's the result of circumstances. Take a moment to reflect on how easily this happens. Someone doesn't reply to your message. You might think they're ignoring you. But perhaps their phone is unavailable. Perhaps they're busy. Perhaps they saw the message and forgot to respond. The important point isn't that your interpretation is always wrong. Sometimes people really are rude. Sometimes someone really is careless. The strange part is that we often don't have enough information to know. Yet the mind prefers explanations that feel complete. And personality provides a simple explanation. That's just the kind of person they are. Situational explanations are usually more complicated. They require us to consider things we cannot see. What happened before this moment? What pressures are they experiencing? What information do they have? What might be happening outside our view? This bias can quietly shape relationships. A friend seems distant, and we assume they're angry. A coworker makes a mistake, and we decide they're incompetent. A stranger behaves impatiently, and we label them selfish. We may never discover what was actually happening. And the same thing can happen in reverse. Someone may judge us based on a single action, while knowing nothing about the circumstances surrounding it. Take a slow breath. Think about a time when someone misunderstood something you did. You knew the full story. They only saw the final action. From their perspective, their judgment may have seemed obvious. From yours, it may have seemed completely unfair. Both experiences can exist at the same time. This is one reason psychological humility can be so valuable. Before deciding what someone's behavior says about their character, we can pause and ask, what else might explain this? That single question creates space between observation and judgment. And perhaps that space is where understanding begins. But there is another strange twist. Sometimes we don't even need to know another person's behavior to start forming an impression of them. A face, a voice, a posture, or a first encounter can be enough. Within moments, the mind begins constructing a story about who someone is. And once that first impression forms, it can become surprisingly difficult to change. The stranger standing in front of us becomes a person we've already decided we know. And that leads us to the mysterious power of first impressions. 26. The first impression that refuses to disappear. Imagine meeting someone for the first time. You shake their hand. They smile. Perhaps they seem confident. Maybe they're quiet. Maybe they avoid eye contact. Within just a few moments, something happens almost automatically. Your mind begins forming a story. Friendly, arrogant, shy, interesting, untrustworthy. You haven't had a real conversation yet. You don't know their history. You don't know what kind of day they're having. You don't know what they're worried about or what they've been through. And yet, your brain has already started making predictions. This is the remarkable power of first impressions. Humans are extremely quick to form judgments about other people based on limited information. Facial expressions, posture, tone of voice, clothing, gestures, and even the context in which we meet someone can influence those early impressions. The strange part is how quickly these judgments can appear. Sometimes, the mind seems to reach a conclusion before conscious reasoning has even begun. Imagine walking into a room and seeing someone sitting quietly in the corner. You might interpret their silence as confidence, or shyness, or boredom, or arrogance. The same behavior can support completely different stories. Your brain fills in the missing information. And once that first interpretation forms, something interesting can happen. Later information may be interpreted through the lens of the original impression. If you initially decide that someone is kind, their mistakes may seem accidental. If you initially decide they're selfish, the same mistakes might appear deliberate. This connects to a broader psychological phenomenon known as the halo effect. When we form a positive impression of one characteristic, that positive feeling can spill over into our judgments about other characteristics. Someone who appears confident may also seem more intelligent. Someone who is attractive may be judged as more trustworthy or capable, even when there is no logical reason for those qualities to be connected. Take a moment to reflect on how strange that is. We can move from one observation to an entire personality story. A smile becomes kindness. Confidence becomes intelligence. Quietness becomes arrogance. A particular style becomes a judgment about character. And yet, the person remains largely unknown. Of course, first impressions can sometimes be useful. Our brains need to make quick social judgments. In unfamiliar situations, rapidly estimating whether someone seems approachable or threatening can be valuable. But speed comes with a cost. The less information we have, the more heavily we may rely on assumptions. And assumptions can become difficult to notice because they feel like observations. You may think, they are unfriendly, when what you actually know is, they didn't speak much during our first conversation. Those are very different statements. Take a slow breath. Think about someone you know well today. Now remember the first time you met them. How different was your first impression from your understanding of them now? Perhaps someone who initially seemed distant became a close friend. Perhaps someone who seemed impressive turned out to be very different. The person didn't necessarily change. Your information changed. And as more information arrived, the original story had to make room for a more complicated one. But sometimes, the mind does something even stranger. Once we form an impression, we may unconsciously behave in ways that encourage the other person to act consistently with it. If we expect someone to dislike us, we may become colder toward them. They respond to our coldness. We interpret their response as proof. And suddenly, the original expectation appears correct. A prediction has helped create the reality it seemed to predict. That brings us to our next psychological effect. The self-fulfilling prophecy. 27. The prediction that creates itself. Imagine walking into a room, believing that everyone there is going to dislike you. You don't know anyone. Nobody has said anything. But the thought is already there. Because you're expecting rejection, you become quieter. You avoid eye contact. You speak less. When someone smiles at you, you wonder if they're being polite. When someone looks away, you assume they don't want to talk. Eventually, the people around you may notice your distance. Perhaps they stop trying to start conversations. You leave thinking, I knew they wouldn't like me. But something strange has happened. The expectation you began with may have helped create the outcome you feared. This is the self-fulfilling prophecy, a psychological process in which expectations influence behavior in ways that can contribute to producing the expected result. In simple terms, what we believe will happen can sometimes change how we behave, and our behavior can influence what actually happens. Imagine a teacher who believes one student is exceptionally capable. Without consciously intending to, the teacher may give that student more encouragement, more challenging questions, more attention, and more opportunities to participate. The student receives these signals. They become more confident. They participate more. They improve. Eventually, the student's performance may appear to confirm the teacher's original belief. The expectation has become part of the environment that shaped the outcome. This doesn't mean expectations magically control reality. Other factors matter. People are complicated. Circumstances change. And sometimes a prediction simply turns out to be wrong. But expectations can influence behavior enough to create interesting feedback loops. Take a moment to think about relationships. Suppose you believe someone is angry with you. You become defensive. They notice your defensiveness and become confused or irritated. You interpret their reaction as evidence that they really are angry. So you become even more defensive. Neither person may realize what started the cycle. The original belief becomes reinforced by the behavior it helped produce. Something similar can happen with confidence. If you expect yourself to fail, you may hesitate. You prepare less. You avoid taking risks. When difficulties appear, you interpret them as confirmation that you aren't capable. But if you expect yourself to handle a challenge, you may approach it differently. You persist longer. You ask for help. You notice opportunities. The outcome can change. Again, this doesn't mean simply thinking positively guarantees success. Reality has limits. But our expectations can influence the actions we take within those limits. And that is what makes the effect so fascinating. Sometimes we aren't simply predicting the future. We are participating in its construction. Take a slow breath. Think about an expectation you've carried for a long time. Perhaps you believe you're bad at meeting people. Perhaps you believe you always make mistakes. Perhaps you expect certain situations to go badly. Ask yourself gently, does this belief describe reality, or has it also been influencing the way I behave inside reality? The distinction can be difficult to see, but noticing it can create a little more freedom. Because once you recognize the loop, you can sometimes interrupt it. And there is another strange psychological effect hiding nearby. Sometimes our expectations don't merely influence our behavior. They can change the way we experience an event itself. We may become convinced that something feels good, bad, exciting, boring, painful, or meaningful, partly because of what we expected it to feel like. In other words, the mind doesn't simply predict what will happen. Sometimes the prediction becomes part of the experience. And that brings us to our final strange psychological effect, the expectation effect. 28. When expectation becomes experience. Imagine you're about to watch a movie that everyone has told you is extraordinary. Your friends describe it as unforgettable. They tell you the story is brilliant. They say you won't want to look away. So you sit down with high expectations. The opening begins. You're watching carefully. You notice details. You search for the things everyone promised you would love. And perhaps, by the end, you genuinely enjoy the movie. Now imagine watching exactly the same film without hearing anything about it beforehand. The story may feel different. The scenes may surprise you differently. You may notice other details. The movie hasn't changed. Your expectations have. This is a final glimpse into one of the strangest features of the human mind. Expectations can shape experience itself. We often imagine that perception works in one direction. Something happens outside us. Our senses detect it. Then we experience it. But the process is more interactive. The brain is constantly making predictions about what it expects to encounter and comparing those predictions with incoming information. What we expect can influence what we notice, how we interpret ambiguity, and sometimes how an experience feels. Think about food. If you're told that a particular dish is delicious, you may approach the first bite differently. You pay attention to its flavors. You search for the qualities you've been promised. If you're told the same dish is terrible, you may become sensitive to every unpleasant detail. The food is physically the same, but your experience can be different. Take a moment to reflect on how many parts of daily life arrive with expectations attached. A conversation you think will be awkward. A meeting you expect to be boring. A place you expect to be beautiful. A person you expect to be difficult. A day you expect to go badly. Before the event even begins, your mind has already started preparing a version of reality. And once that version exists, it can influence attention. You may notice evidence that fits the expectation more easily than evidence that contradicts it. This doesn't mean that perception is imaginary. The external world remains real. If it's raining, your expectations won't make the sky sunny. But within the enormous amount of information reaching your senses, expectations can influence what becomes psychologically prominent. And perhaps this explains why two people can leave the same concert, restaurant, conversation, or journey with completely different impressions. They experienced the same external event, but they didn't arrive with the same mind. One arrived hopeful, another skeptical. One was tired, another excited. One expected disappointment, another expected wonder. The experience was partly constructed from the meeting between the event and the person experiencing it. Take a slow breath. Think about the possibility that every ordinary moment contains more information than you consciously notice. Your brain selects, interprets, predicts, fills gaps, updates assumptions, and then quietly turns all of that activity into what you experience as reality. That may be the deepest theme running through all 28 effects we've explored. The mind isn't a passive window looking out at the world. It is an active participant. It remembers selectively. It compares. It anchors. It becomes attached. It fears losses. It searches for confirmation. It predicts the future. It interprets other people. It responds to imagined events. And sometimes, without realizing it, it changes the very experience it is trying to understand. So as this journey comes to an end, perhaps there's no need to solve every mystery. Instead, simply notice. Notice the next thought that appears. Notice what your attention chooses. Notice the assumptions hiding inside ordinary moments. Take one final slow breath. The world outside you continues exactly as it always has. But inside your mind, thousands of quiet processes are unfolding every second. And perhaps the strangest psychological effect of all is realizing that you are experiencing reality through a mind you will never completely see from the outside.